Castro's rule had impacted the world. At one point, it almost brought the world to destruction. Because he encouraged it, it almost happened in the Cuban Missile Crisis, almost destroyed the entire earth. And yet it was the ancient mystery of God that brought his reign to an end. I'm going to share something kind of very special, kind of a story behind world events. It was a secret meeting. I was driven to a house in northern New Jersey, in which was a man who requested to see me. We met in the living room. He was short, he was elderly, he was bald, he was stocky. His name was Samuel. He spoke to me through a translator. He spoke in Spanish. He had come to America with a mission, to ask me to go to his homeland. His homeland was an island. He said it had been under a curse, under oppression. The island was the island of Cuba. The believers of Cuba were under persecution. But he said a change was coming. And I'm going to tell you what that change was. In January 1959, Fidel Castro and his armies of revolutionaries entered the city of Havana. They set up a revolutionary government to rule the island. Many Cubans greeted him with cheers and hope and optimism, but that would quickly fade. There would come arrests, imprisonments, indoctrination into communist ideology, the crushing of all dissent, the execution by firing squad of those who were viewed as enemies of the state. Many tried to escape the island. Many lost their homes, their possessions. A persecution was launched against Christians. Churches were closed. Pastors were exiled or imprisoned, sent to re-education camps. Christians were driven underground. Under Castro's reign, Cuba became a land that was paralyzed, impoverished, hopeless, and under totalitarian repression. But the man in the living room said a change was coming. After decades of oppression, Castro had agreed to allow for 1 month of religious freedom, 1 month of religious expression to come to Cuba. It would take the form of a month-long celebration of born-again believers. During that time, they would be free to worship in a series of mass public events to be held throughout the island and broadcast over Cuban television. The last event would take place, the last main event would take place in Havana in Revolution Square. Samuel was one of those, a believer, given charge to organize this celebration. He said, I came on behalf of the Christians of Cuba. We want you to come and inaugurate the month of celebration by sounding the shofar, the ram's horn, at the first event. We want you to minister throughout the island. I prayed about it and said yes. A week before I was about to leave for Cuba, a man showed up at Beth Israel. He asked to speak to me after the service. He had come from Cuba. He was a pastor. He had been arrested for his faith and imprisoned in Castro's prison camps. After his release, the door opened for him to come to America. He just happened to be at the end of the service where I said, pray because we're going to Cuba next week. So he spoke to me afterwards and he gave me this word, like a prophetic word. He said, you will be given access to go where others have not gone. The doors will open before you and you will enter the king's palace. When I prayed what I should share on the island, I was given the message of the Jubilee. A message of freedom, restoration, reconciliation, liberation, the ending of bondage. Now they were under bondage. And I'm proclaiming freedom. It was a dangerous message, but I knew it was the message I had to share. The entire month of celebration would be ushered in with the sounding of the instrument of the Jubilee. I sent word to the leaders who invited me saying that the word I got is on the Jubilee. And I thought of the phrase, the Jubilee is coming. And it wasn't long before believers in Cuba were referring to the celebration as El Jubileo, the Jubilee. And as the event drew near, those 3 Spanish words began appearing throughout the island on churches, on houses, posters, walls, fences, taxi cabs. El Jubileo viene, the Jubilee is coming. We arrived at the airport, which was manned by Cuban soldiers. They held us all up because they wouldn't let us go through because of something they found in my suitcase. It was the shofar. They thought it was a weapon. So the soldiers were inspecting it, holding it up, for a long time, and finally I decided, let me just go up to them. So I went up to them, I took the shofar, I said, look, it's an instrument, it's a good thing. Watch. I set it to my mouth, and I sounded it in the airport. And then they let us go. The shofar is an instrument of breakthrough, of pulling down walls, and in the airport, the walls came down, and they let us in. We arrived a week before the first gathering that would inaugurate the celebration. We ministered at that time, and I was told that everywhere we ministered, there were government informants in every church, in every place, to report if anything was said that the government didn't want. So here I am speaking of the Jubilee, freedom, liberation, the greater revolution of God. My translator is stumbling, is like ready to faint, afraid we're both going to end up in a prison camp. And everywhere I went, I brought the shofar, and the Cuban believers saw it as a sign of freedom. We had been warned never to attract a crowd, and outside the walls of a church, but it happened anyway. Our host took us to a convenience store to pick up some items. I left the shofar in the van. When we returned, we found the van, surrounding the van was a crowd of Cubans. One of them had looked into the van and spotted the shofar. And he told the others, now they were all around and they're begging me to blow the shofar. I'm thinking like, I'm not supposed to draw a crowd, it's already here. But I did. The moment after the sound went, we hear a shouting, a shrieking from the crowd, and a thin middle-aged man is jumping up and down, and we're saying, what happened? And they said, what happened is the man is deaf, but when you blew it, he heard the sound of the shofar. But everything that happened to Cuba focused on one man, which was Fidel Castro. His reign began in 1959. The Jubilean ordinance reads, you shall count 7 Sabbaths of years for yourself, 7 times 7 years, 7 Sabbaths of years to the 49th year, and then the Jubilee. 7 times 7. And then you have the 50th year. What happens if you count 7 sevens of years from the beginning of Castro's reign? It says, it shall be to you 49 years, and then comes the Jubilean year. Where does it come to? 1959? It comes to the beginning of 2008. 2008 would be the Jubilee of Fidel Castro's reign in power. Could that be significant? At 81 years old, with health problems, Castro sends a letter to Cuba and the world, and he resigns as president in the year of Jubilee. His Jubilee, his entire reign was framed by the Jubilee from Leviticus. What began when Castro heard the news that Batista had abdicated in the start of 1959, January 1st, came to the end in 2008, the 50th year. The reign of Castro had impacted the world for generations. The Jubilee reverses what was done. It brings release, it brings restoration. All over the island, these posters are saying, the Jubilee's coming, the Jubilee's coming. We're proclaiming the Jubilee, having no idea. And it would come to its close at the exact time of the Jubilee. And there's even more. Batista, when he set in motion his resignation, it was December 31st, 1959. If you start the countdown from that exact day that Batista set in motion his resignation, 7 sevens, 49 years, beginning of the 50th year, and 7 sevens of days to the 50th day, it brings you, or the Jubilean day, it brings you to February 18th, 2008. On that very day, Castro writes his resignation. The 50th day of the 50th year. Now, Batista's resignation went into effect after midnight, January 1st, 1959, in the wee hours of the night. Castro's letter of resignation on the 50th year and the 50th day goes into effect after midnight. Batista resigned in the early hours of January 1st, 1959. He headed for the plane, took off. It all took place about, it says, 3 a.m. On the 50th day of the 50th year from the moment of that departure, the official site of the Central Committee of the Cuban Communist Party releases on the web, the internet, on their paper, Castro's resignation. When did it happen? Just about 3 a.m., 3 in the morning, to the exact hour. After Messiah was born, and after the Magi came, King Herod would die. Castro would, of course, die as well. They brought his body to be displayed inside the tower that was shaped as the star that marked the end of the journey, and as Herod's final days were linked to the star. And that new life of Messiah is in the land, and so there's this revival that never stopped in Cuba. It's not stopped. It's hard to fathom for most people that behind the events and movements and history lies a deeper story and an unseen hand, the hand of God. Castro's rule had impacted the world. At one point, it almost brought the world to destruction because he encouraged it. It almost happened in the Cuban Missile Crisis, almost destroyed the entire earth. And yet it was the ancient mystery of God that brought his reign to an end. The same mystery that brought a son of the land back to his ancestral possession. And each mystery was linked to the Jubilee, one in space and the other in time. And you know, the Jubilee, those who lost what was theirs, they get it back. But those who took what was not theirs, it gets taken away. So Castro, his power was taken away with the Jubilee. And if you take any one of these events away, all these twists and quirks, it never would have happened exactly as it did to the exact time. Batista had resigned as president of Cuba. Castro had not been president of Cuba. He had a million other titles, but in the last part of his reign, he takes the title of president, so it's going to match exactly what happened to Batista. He resigns from the presidency. And the mystery there, it was actually all in the Jubilee, and we had no idea. I had no idea, but I knew I had to give him the shofar, the sign of the Jubilee. I knew I had to give him the word about the Jubilee. Castro's reign had been the longest reign of any modern leader, except the Queen of England. The American government had tried to overthrow him. It said that the CIA tried to assassinate him. They tried to put an explosive in his cigars, but he outlasted every one of them. He outlasted the Cold War, the fall of the Soviet Union, about 10 presidents, but in the end, it was the Jubilee that ended it. The ordinance of Leviticus 25 that determined exactly how long it would last, exactly to the day.